This video is the fourth in a retrospective series about the entirety of Pretty Cure. You can watch it on its own, but be warned that I may make mentions of prior Pre-Cure seasons, and any of them are on the table for spoilers. Thank you. I just said in my last big video when talking about Futari wa Pretty Cure Splash Star that I'm of the belief that it's best for a magical girl show to have a minimum of 3 magical girls that all have varying relationships with one another in order to keep things from getting stale. So it's like I'm really getting what I wished for when it came to that, because this season went beyond that, giving us 5 characters to enjoy, hence that little 5 there in the name. I have to admit that I am not a fan of the title of this one, as it doesn't tell us anything about the series other than that we're going to have 5 Pretty Cures taking part in it. Yes, Pretty Cure 5 also doesn't exactly roll off the tongue, does it? And it will forever annoy me that the 4th season of this show has the number 5 in the title. However, none of that speaks to the quality of the season itself. To be fair, it might frustrate me mildly, but hey, let's let the show stand on its own. The big theme this time around was the idea of hope versus despair, and yes, this does predate Danganronpa by a full 3 years. This is one of those subjects that has some interesting angles that you can view it from compared to the whole concept of light versus darkness that one of the prior seasons ran on. Hope and despair are more flexible concepts, so you can play around with what your meaning of hope or despair is, what causes it, and what we can do with it. For Yes 5, the concept of hope is the capability to keep your head high, keep your heart strong, and keep moving forward. Its concept of hope is very forward-facing, holding on to what can be rather than what just is right now. Consequently, the season's view of despair is about getting mired in the troubles of the past or the present, about allowing yourself to be stopped by the circumstances around you, to give up rather than holding on to that view of the future that its idea of hope is constructed around. As such, this is perhaps the most forward-facing season of the show so far. Prior seasons didn't really look much further into the future than what was pretty immediate, at most looking into what would happen when the goal of the season was accomplished, if we knew what any consequences of that were at all. This time around, we have an idea of what these girls might end up striving for in the long term, what drives them, and where they're going. There's a bit of emphasis put on the girls figuring out what they want to do with the rest of their lives beyond just in the moment and looking forward towards their adult lives, which is a new take we haven't really gotten before, but I find myself enjoying. This even happens at slightly different paces for each of the girls, though I could have used some more variation. It's really a difference between if they know where they would like things to go at the start with a few speed bumps along the way, or do they not figure it out until near the end of the season and really only vocalize it within the last 2 episodes? It might have been nice to spread this a little more through the season to give each of these revelations about the cast a little more time to breathe. We'll get into talking about that cast in a minute, but before that, let's get into what the goal for the season is this time before we get too off track, in case anyone needs a little bit of a refresher. As usual, we have some kind of magical otherworld that's in some level of danger that we have to deal with. This time it's the Palmier Kingdom, a quaint little place that's inhabited by little mascot animals. But unlike other times in the series where we're trying to protect it, this time it's already been completely razed into a wasteland. We're starting from the lowest point, but hey, it's already destroyed, so it can't get that much worse. We're not told about the state of most of the citizens, just that they've vanished, so the big Hail Mary to try and bring them back is to collect 55 little sprites called Pinkies into a magical item called the Dream Colette, which will grant a single wish to the holder when that's done. As far as trying to save a kingdom goes, it's a decent enough plan, all things considered, but before we get into how things actually play out, let's take a look at the characters that are taking us on this adventure. This season, given that there was a wider range of characters, I kept a new tally in my notes as I was curious just how much episodes would be spread around between the characters of the show. Like, sometimes there's just episodes that really focus on one character or 2, and then there are others that are more focused on the group as a whole. I am not saying my methodology was foolproof, let's get that straight right away. This was mostly based on vibes and personal perception when I reached the end of an episode as to who I thought it was about. Someone else could watch these episodes and end up with a completely different character breakdown of who they thought was the focus of each one. There are some episodes that you might think were about a certain character, while I felt they split their screen time pretty evenly with another character. Whenever I talk about these breakdowns in relation to talking about the characters, please take that with a grain of salt, is what I'm trying to get at. Like I mentioned before, we have 5 different Pretty Cure this time around, and I think instead of my usual order of most to talk about to least, this time we'll start with the less interesting characters and work our way towards talking about the ones that are more interesting. It's not that any of these characters are really bad or anything, it's more that I think they can be a little thin at times. I'll be honest, Aurora or Cure Lemonade is the one that least interested me over the course of the season, and I think that's because she's the one that had the least personal growth out of the entire group. It doesn't help that she's mostly just nice and polite, and that's about it. She can feel pretty shallow at times since it's not like there's anything super wild happening with her. Part of that comes from the fact that she's one of the ones that knows what she wants to do from the start of the series. She wants to be an actress. That's totally fine, and as someone who was a devout theater kid, I can totally understand it. In fact, by the start of the series, she already has an agent and bookings. She's even known around school as the girl who gets small parts in locally produced TV shows. At the start of the series, her problem is that she's so serious about her work that she doesn't have any friends, since she spends her downtime during school practicing lines rather than hanging out with other students. That would be an interesting place for her to grow from, but the moment she gets involved in all the Pretty Cure shenanigans in episode 3, she has a built-in friend group that she hangs out with and who supports her. So this is never something she needs to grow past by her own efforts. The moment she has these built-in friends, she's all fine and good and even socializes with them pretty effortlessly. There's not even a moment where she considers making more friends outside the friend group. At the start of the season, she's already well on her way to her goals and a pretty well-rounded and settled person. So the most the series can do is put a few speed bumps in her way, like having her run into a problem when she's on set at a job, or having her have some trouble figuring out what kind of line she's going to ad-lib for an audition that's asking her to do that. The biggest speed bump she gets is her manager trying to push her into starting a small singing career alongside her acting, and her not being sure if she wants to split her focus or not. This is something that she's kind of pressured entirely into doing by everyone around her, but goes along with it because she has her friends to back her up. Her hesitation lasts for all of 1 episode, and when we get to the end of the season and all the characters are spending a moment talking about what they're striving for, she basically goes, "Yeah, and I learned that I like singing," which feels less like an arc and more like picking up a new hobby. Aurora really lacks presence within the series as well. Based on how I broke down the episodes, she had one of the lowest totals for episodes that I felt were just about her. And even when it felt like she was sharing the screen with someone else, it was often more in a way that they both had something going on, rather than the episode being about her relationship with another character. She's one that's always there with the group, but ironically doesn't feel like she has much of a chance to get the spotlight. For example, just after the midway point of the series, there's the introduction of each girl getting a unique weapon that they can summon in order to perform an attack that's stronger than the one they had before. The first time they manage to summon this weapon on their own is sort of treated like it's a bit of a big moment, and it's often a bit of an emotional climax to the episode. When this happens for Aurora, though, I was all ready to classify it in my notes as being an episode all about another character, Nozomi, since most of the episode had consisted of Nozomi running around and basically acting as an assistant to make sure the event Aurora was taking part in goes smoothly after being mistaken for being her manager. However, at the end, Aurora summons her weapon after having less presence in the episode than Nozomi did, an episode that feels like it should have been about Aurora if the climax was focused on her, ends up feeling shared, taking that spotlight from her. I think part of this just comes down to the way that Aurora was a little bit of the odd man out among the cast. She's the youngest in the group, and she's also the only one that comes in without having a pre-established relationship with someone else who winds up as part of the group. When you look at those relationships, it's 2 pairs, and then the spare that is Aurora. It's not that I dislike her, but even by the end of the season, I didn't really feel like I knew her all that well, which was disappointing. Then we have Reen, or Cure Rouge. She's the childhood bestie of the pink protagonist of the season, and the second one that ends up in the group as a result of her bestie not being able to resist sharing what's going on with her once she gets magic powers. When she becomes the Precure, she's classified as being the cure of passion, and I think that does suit her really well. She's a character that puts her all into the things she cares about and goes about it with this really active verve about her. She's fairly straightforward and doesn't really mince words, but you can tell she's coming from a place of caring, even if it might sting just a little bit. She's got this spark of personality to her that I really like. This spark lets her get into interesting dynamics with other characters as well, which makes her feel like she's really part of the group. Early on, there's an episode where her competitive streak comes out when dealing with another character who's got the same sort of competitive edge to her, and that's a character dynamic that feels like it naturally grew out of the both of them. It's not something that happens over and over again either, since that would be both repetitive and annoying, but it's something that they loop back to at the end of the season, showing the way that the two of them have really grown to appreciate each other and have built a solid friendship. It was good to see something from so early on looped back in at the end of the season, making it a real full circle moment. Reen's also our resident sporty character, which has been a bit of a staple for each season to have leading up till now. Bryn takes it up to 11 though, with every sports team wanting to have her on it so that she can help lead them to victory because she's just that athletic. It leads you to wonder why she's not on any of the teams at all, and that ends up being answered in revealing one of her more defining qualities to us: her strong sense of responsibility. She feels she can't commit to a team because she needs to help out in the family flower shop. She can't assure that she would be able to give her team her all while doing that, something that same sense of responsibility would demand from her if she did commit. She does eventually settle into getting a sports commitment after this is dealt with in the middle of the season, to be clear, settling on futsal as her main sport. When she does get that, it feels satisfying too, since the episode focused around this gives a lot of insight into the way that she feels she's got a lot on her shoulders, much of it self-imposed. What I perhaps appreciate the most about Reen, though, is that she's an athletic girl that's treated a little differently than the ones that came before. Both Nagisa and Saki were a little bit of the dumb jock character, but Reen is someone who loves sports, but isn't fully focused on them. She's got other interests beyond her sport, and I love that they're ones that are a little more traditionally feminine than you would expect to be given to a character of her type. I love when a female character is allowed to have that kind of balance to them, since so many tend to get tipped in one direction or the other. And with Reen, it's clearly done in a way to flesh her out rather than something certain anime like to do, where they give the badass female side character a single feminine trait, like being able to sew, to demonstrate her as wife material. Not that I would expect that sort of behavior from a show aimed at little girls, but it is something that happens in some anime genres quite a bit. Rin isn't just into sports alone. She actually likes flowers a lot and likes helping out at the family shop. The girl actually has some very strong opinions about flowers, which is very fun. She gets crushes and likes making jewelry and accessories here and there, which leads her to eventually realize that's what she wants to go into in the future. The path towards that isn't something that gets focused on a whole lot, popping up just a handful of times. However, it's nice to see that progression from doing something for fun to getting better at it and challenging herself to realizing that's what she wants to do with her life. Komachi, or Cure Mint, is a character that I find pretty damn relatable. She's the other one who knows what she wants to do with her life at the start of the series, aspiring to be a novelist. And boy, that was like looking at my 6th grade self. See, I spent a lot of time writing all through middle and high school, even a little bit into college. You know how it goes. The middle school kid who read way too many books growing up and thought they were going to be the one to write the next great American novel, or the next great YA novel at least. Needless to say, my writing from that time is pretty bad, but hey, that's part of getting better, right? You have to start off by writing garbage. There's an episode that I really want to focus in on, as it's where a lot of Komachi's arc starts. She's sharing her writing with the group, and all her friends just fawn over it, telling her she's such a great writer. Then it gets passed off to one of the mascots, who is a big reader, Nuts. He reads it and just comes straight out and tells her it's not very good. And yeah, that's something that kind of has to happen at some point. You see, when you share the stuff with close friends at that age, a lot of the time they're going to tell you it's good. My best friend always told me that my writing was great and she wanted more of the disconnected scenes that I was toying around with. Here's the thing, my writing was bad. We didn't have a super wide perspective and a full understanding of what made a story good. Over time, I improved, yeah, but I needed to have my perspective readjusted, which was something that happened over time as I was growing up. My disappointment is the way that the show kind of treats Nuts like he's the bad guy for doing this, for starting Komachi on the path to get that perspective. Could he have worded things a little more kindly and given an actual critique? Sure, but it's not like he was given much of a chance to do that when the rest of the cast jumped on him for saying it wasn't good. The two characters seem to get an understanding by the end of the episode at least, but it's also clear that Komachi has gotten that perspective shift. It's a little disappointing that it leads to her needing to find her full confidence again, and I can see why some people would upset that she had her confidence tore down, but it was something that needed to happen if she was going to get any better, as harsh as that might sound. As such, a lot of her arc that follows is her trying out different things with her writing and gaining her confidence with her craft, which, as someone who's gone through that, was fun to see watch happen to someone else. The problem is that since most of the writing happens off screen, Komachi is a character that doesn't get a ton of solo focus. Of the characters, she was the one I found most likely to have her episodes either be about her relationship with another character or simply be splitting the screen time with someone else. There's a grand total of 2 episodes that I feel are entirely about her and not anyone else, which is a shame. She ends up coming off as something of a support character to others as a result. Her arc is something that happens somewhat off to the side, much like Urara's, and I think that's just once again a byproduct of her already knowing what she wants out of her future from the start of the series. We skip right over that discovery phase of her figuring things out. I would have loved to see her get more spotlight since I think she does have something to offer, but as the quieter and more bookish one of the group, she wasn't likely to be the one speaking up when the whole group was together. Karen, or Cure Aqua, is a bit of an interesting case. She's got a really strong start, but then tapers off, only to come back at the very end of the season for just a flash to wrap things up. Karen is the first time that someone has a chance to become a Pretty Cure and then just doesn't. We're introduced at first to Karen as the strict student body president who's always handling things on her own and doesn't need help from anyone else. She's focused, diligent, and as we discover spending time with her early in the season, horribly lonely. She's the last one to join the team, but because she's got this focus on handling things herself without the help of others, when the magic butterfly that the others have gotten arrives to her, it just doesn't take and flies away. This is the first time that we see someone who should be a precure fail to become one, and it's completely because her head isn't in the right place to be a functional member of the team. This is something that is resolved in just the next episode, mind you, but for a moment she's sitting there as the one that failed, and in the follow-up that weighs heavy on her, forcing some self-examination to get her to grow as a person. And it's not long later, after she gets into a good place with this, that she ends up having this great moment where the villain of the episode pulls the whole "if you want something right, do it yourself," and she's able to vocalize how untrue that is and how she's learned from that. It's great getting to see her grow enough that she's able to pass on what she's learned. And then she just doesn't have much of a focus for a really long stretch. It's like once that lesson was internalized, the writers weren't entirely sure where to take her or what they wanted to do with her, so they set her aside until they figured that out. She does eventually get an episode where she takes care of another character who is sick, and that starts to get the gears turning for her to eventually realize that she'd like to be a doctor. Though I personally found the episode more notable for the way she has an awesome horseback fight where she turns her attack into a lance. Seriously, that's what stands out to me about that one. It's super cool. However, the arc of her figuring out she wants to be a doctor is pretty disconnected from her arc early in the season, making it feel like she's a bit split in half. Especially with that break in focus getting put on her spotlight shared as we work in relationships with other characters instead of her as an individual. Though I am a fan of the episode where her old habits rear their head for a moment when she's stressed, because it seems that every single one of the school clubs is asking something of her all at once. She manages to find her footing and figure things out with teamwork, but that moment is a good way of conveying that she's still learning and growing, since growth isn't always something that is completely linear. And for the last, we have our pink protagonist of the season, Cure Dream, or Nozomi. Nozomi sure is the pink one in that she follows the traditions of Nagisa and Saki before her. She's enthusiastic, bubbly, and not the best at school. She's bright and cheery and just about what you would expect out of someone who is the lead of the season. We're not changing things all that drastically just because there are more characters after all. At the start of the series, and for a very, very long time, Nozomi has no clue what it is she wants to do with her life and doesn't really have any purpose that she is dedicating herself to or chasing after. However, instead of allowing this to leave her listless like so many other anime characters, This has just made her all the more energetic, since it's all the more reason to get up each and every day because this might be the day that she figures things out. It's a nice way to give her this real sense of life to her and a delightful energy. In lieu of her not figuring out what she wants to do with herself just yet, she sets her goal as being that of the mascots of the season in the meantime, dedicating herself to fulfilling their dream and restoring the destroyed kingdom, since it's not like she's figured out what her own dream is yet anyway. Nozomi is once again one of those cases where the main character is bad at school, but she isn't dumb. She's actually pretty smart. It's just that school isn't something that suits the way she functions and the way she goes about her life. What I love is they actually dedicate a whole episode early on to dealing with the fact that she's not good with schoolwork and studying in a way that is far more sympathetic than any of the other episodes trying to tack the not good at school trait onto their other characters. Instead of just showing a character get bad test scores, this time around they actually take an episode to dive into why that might be. Nozomi has trouble focusing on things that don't interest her very much, while she can hyper-fixate on things that do catch her attention. And her friends don't really get that. You can kind of tell they're really trying to help her study, but they don't understand her thought processes and why she can't just buckle down and study normally like the rest of them. Honestly, I don't think I could blame anyone for considering the possibility that Nozomi might have ADHD. It might not be intentional on the part of the writers, but it's something that I think you can totally read into her given the way her character plays out. I personally see it, and I think it's pretty damn cool that we're giving sympathy to a girl who is struggling in school rather than just having jokes at her expense for the entirety of the series. Over the series, we do see some improvement too. It's minimal at first, her test scores only going up a little bit, but this is a process that will take time to see any great amount of change. By the end of the season, she has decent, if average, test scores. This isn't something that comes up super often or anything, but the fact that we remember to circle back around to that plot point is great to see. The downside is that the rest of the cast don't seem to see this, or even consider the effort she's putting in. There's an episode in the midsection of the series where Nozomi's mom has gotten sick, and like so many kids, she's gotten it into her head that she's gonna be the one to take care of her mom. Though, even in doing so, she might inadvertently create more work for the sick person in question. It would be a sweet episode, if not for the way everyone just assumes that Nozomi will be completely incompetent at helping her mom like that. She struggles, for sure, but it's disappointing to see that none of them have any real strong faith in her. Like, I get it, she's a bit of a mess and a screw-up at times, but she's not a complete buffoon. The episode tries to play it off at the end by all the girls trying to help and also being fairly incompetent at things, just more certain that they're not. But by that point, the damage is already done, and it feels like a bit of a band-aid over the whole affair. By the end of the season, most of them seem to have come around after seeing how hard Nozomi goes at the Precure stuff, but there's a decent stretch where their faith in her feels lacking, which is odd given that they're the ones that audibly chose her as their leader early on. As for her future at the end of the series, Nozomi has decided she'd like to be a teacher. While I can see the thought process there and do think it suits her, it's also something that comes a little bit out of left field. Rin and Karen seem to have a moment where they experience something that set them in the general direction of the careers that they eventually settled on for themselves, but in the case of Nozomi, I don't think I ever really saw that moment. Maybe I just missed it or misinterpreted the moment that was meant to set her on that path, but it's just something that never really felt like it came from a solid place for me. And to reveal it in the twilight moments of the series when everything is otherwise wrapped up feels a touch cheap. I think it actually could have been fine for her to still not really know what she wanted to do with her life, but I can completely understand wanting to give her character more closure than that. For me, Nozomi is pretty serviceable as a lead character. She feels like there's a decent amount of her to grab onto and run with, and it's not like I was upset to see her on my screen either. She does have some really wonderful character highlights over the course of the season. For example, the mid-season two-parter where she's really a major focus is really great, and we'll get into it later, but I think Nozomi really shines in this season's movie. However, despite these highlights, I think she lacks something of a consistent through line at times. Even when her major struggle of having a lack of direction in her life and no real personal goals brought up, it's never done as something that she's internally considering, always coming in the form of another character pointing it out to her. Still, I think she does have some level of growth as she becomes a competent leader over the course of the series and up into the finale, which we'll put a pin into for now so we can talk about the rest of the cast. What's odd to me is the way that after having a robust, if a little underdeveloped roster of side characters in the last season, this time around things have been severely whittled down. To be fair, with so many extra lead characters, it makes sense that cuts have to be made in order to make room for them all to have time in the spotlight. But at the same time, there are barely any side characters this season, like shockingly few. Sure, you may have some background characters that have a line or two here or there, and you have very brief moments where the parents of one of the leads might show up for a single scene, but other than that, there are only 4 who feel like they have any lasting presence in the series, and of those, only 2 of them that I have any substantial thoughts on. Sakamoto is Karen's family butler since she is the resident rich girl of the season. That's simplifying it, since he is also something of a caretaker to her, giving emotional support and such since her parents are gone all the time. He shows up just about every time the crew is at Karen's house, but besides 1 or 2 scenes, he doesn't really have much of a lasting impact. I think an episode more deeply exploring his and Karen's relationship could have been some fertile ground for a story. Washio is also someone who I don't have a lot to say on, but we might as well bring him up real quick since he comes up several times over the course of the season. He's Aurara's manager and the source of her getting that gig as a singer on top of the acting stuff. There's not really anything wrong with him or anything, but he does fall into the bumbling manager archetype. He's clearly getting her work, but he also seems a bit over his head. I think he could have been made marginally more interesting and given a little more reason to be around if you had simply merged him and Aurara's father into one character, though I can see wanting to avoid the potential pitfall of the idea that her father was pushing her into all this acting and stuff. Mrs. Otaka is someone who has a little bit more presence in the series, given that she's the lunch lady at the school, and there are plenty of scenes of the girls eating at the outdoor cafe during lunch. She's never anyone who has a lot of direct impact on the story, but she's there to be a friendly face and crack pretty bad jokes where all the prices in the cafeteria are set overtly too high. She's also someone that gives out a lot of advice pretty on the regular, and pretty decent advice at that. This all makes a lot more sense when you find out she's actually the headmistress of the school and is doing her double duty as the lunch lady in order to be able to hear firsthand how the students are feeling about the state of the school, so she can get a more unfiltered perspective than she normally otherwise would. It's a fun concept, but at least in this season, it's something that's not really expanded on very much, as it's told to the audience once we're already in the thick of things, and isn't revealed to the rest of the cast until almost the end of the season. The side character with real relevance, though, is Mika. Of the side cast, she's the one that seems like she shows up the most, and when she does, is most likely to be directly involved in the main story of the episode. Enough so that she does get something of a focal episode of her own. She's the resident reporter of the school newspaper and is always running around trying to find something that's worth reporting on. She's a fun character overall, a little much, but not enough that she crosses into the territory of being annoying. There's even an episode where we actually grapple with the journalistic ethics of her being a somewhat biased lens for just a hot second. Early in the season, it feels like there's going to be something of a plot thread about her slowly learning more and more about the activities of Pretty Cure over the season, where she gets some glimpses of them fighting and even manages to snap a few photos here and there. But this is something that ends up falling a bit by the wayside and never really being followed up on, which I found to be pretty disappointing. Up until this point, there had been a lot of civilians conveniently passing out, or the Pretty Cure of the season being transported to some kind of void away from regular people in order for them to have the fight without the general public finding anything out besides maybe a glimpse. While it is something that could be forgiven as a byproduct of the genre, it's always a little more interesting when someone sees or when the public is involved, even if they think it was a hallucination or dream after the fact. The presence of someone without powers caught up in the mix simply ups the stakes. Unfortunately, Mika does see them face to face, but she's always distracted away by something else that they don't get more than a blurb at best in her reporting. Like, yeah, I get it. We don't want to shred the status quo, but it feels like such a tease to act like it's going to happen and then pull back out at the last minute. Especially when the distraction is nothing more than the power of her running into an attractive guy. She's quite present early in the season, but after an episode that pretty much wraps up her whole deal, she ends up fading into her irrelevancy, which is a little disappointing to see. She never finds out the truth and doesn't get more than a short conversation with the Pretty Cure team, which feels lackluster. I think there was some fun to be had with her, especially since it's not like there were any other real prominent classmates, but maybe she'll get some kind of a role in the next season. At least I can hope anyway. I did like her after all. Now, normally I would go into the mascots at this point, but to say that the mascots of this season are divisive would be an understatement, so I want to hold off on that just a little longer to talk about the villains and how we end up handling them this time around. I think the thing that will most obviously stand out to people when they first start watching this season is in the difference in the villain setting this time around. You see, with the prior villain groups, it was always just this group of baddies who were all hanging out in a dark location. Futariwa and Maxheart had the Dark King's lair and the mansion, and Splashstar had this cave that the big bad was sitting in a throne in. This time around, while the villains are still in another world that's a little bit of a pocket dimension separated from reality, they're also in a city in that world. But one that seems to be fairly deserted from what we can tell, aside from this one building that they're in. So why are they there? Well, this time around the group is Nightmare, and they're a corporate hellscape, which was amusing to me as someone whose day job is working in the corporate side of retail. I am completely permanently remote thanks to the past few years, but prior to that I had put in my time in an actual corporate office, cubicles and all. I was lucky that my workplace is pretty decent and I had good managers that actually watched out for my team, but I am well aware that I am a little lucky in that regard. Granted, this is clearly based more on the Japanese corporate structure for obvious reasons, which makes my experience a little distant. I worked in a fairly casual office after all. But there are some things that are just part of every office setup, like team managers, hierarchy, and deadlines. So what was this able to bring to the table in terms of structure for the season? Not a ton of difference, actually. We've still got characters where their main purpose is to be a sort of cannon fodder for the girls to go up against repeatedly, with escalating power that comes along with that, and then a few who are clearly the next tier up, and then the big bad. I'll get into talking about any of them that actually pulled my attention in just a second, but there is one structural thing I did like this season. Instead of the show being divided in several arcs based around each of the villains one at a time, this time we've got just two, as there are two smaller groups under the big umbrella of the big bad, and while each of these two groups is active, it's a bit of a dice roll to know which villain is going to be the one involved each time. I really appreciated this as it gave things a little more wiggle room in that the villain most appropriate to the episode could be chosen rather than forcing the episode to suit the villain that we were stuck with. Also, it gave a little more room for interactions among the villains, even if there still aren't that many of them in general. Of the first set, two are fairly uninteresting on their own, aside from how they mesh with another character that we'll get into in a minute, but two of them are a bit more interesting. Bunby is the epitome of a middle manager. He's been given a little bit of power, and damn has it gone to his head a little. This guy acts like he knows what he's doing, and he's ascended to a higher position because he's better than everyone else, but at the end of the day, he's just kind of a guy. He's got a bit of that bumbling thing going on, which makes him a character I actually liked. I wasn't exactly rooting for him when it came to the season or anything, but you could tell that he was trying his best, which made him interesting to watch. He does lose direction in the later half of the season, though. With all the folks that were under him losing and completely being destroyed by magical girls, his division is eventually whittled down to just him. Well, him and the swaths of masked background characters that never say a word through the entirety of the season. So his division is disbanded and absorbed into another department where he slips into a team of characters that are the next level up. At this point, it's clear he's the weakling in the room, so he spends his time generally being disregarded and talked down to. He gets thrown off a roof at the end of the season, removing him from relevance entirely. I am unfortunately aware that he survives this roof throwing and will be back next season, but I am looking forward to seeing what he brings to the table there. The nice thing about Bunby is he does seem to legitimately have some level of care for the employees under him. Over the course of the season, various employees of Nightmare will get a black slip, which turns into this black mask that grants immense power to the one who uses it, but it decimates their sense of self, and none of the characters who actually use it survive the episode that they do. Bunby does actually interfere to try and stop at least one of these cases, as the concept seems to shake him up pretty badly, which I think is a nice touch of characterization. I mean, Not wanting to throw your staff into a meat grinder is kind of the bare minimum, but hey, he meets it unlike some of the others. Of the first department, the other one who stands out is Gamao, mostly because he straight up gets fired and kicked out early on the season for being a lazy employee. He spends the rest of his appearances wandering around the streets, failing to keep odd jobs, and blaming everyone but himself for his lack of a solid job. And man, I get it, I don't want to go to work on Monday either, but this guy takes it to extremes. My one real complaint about him is I don't like they chose to make the fat guy the lazy one. It just reeks of stereotyping on the part of the writers. I know that's being done as a visual shorthand, but it's something that's done in shows far too often and carries harmful negative connotations when it shows up so frequently. Still, it's pretty clear from the jump that Gamao never really belonged to his department. He was the odd one out of the initial four. How can you tell? Well, each of these characters has a normal human form. They also have a villain form, each of which is based on some kind of animal. Gamao just doesn't fit the motif of the first department. Bunby is a bee, Girinma is based on a mantis, and surprise, surprise, Arachnia has a spider motif. Gamao, meanwhile, is based on a toad, which just doesn't fit with the insects he's surrounded with. I do think this is a nice touch to show how much he's not really a member of that team, as most of the time when he is the episode villain after his firing, he's acting on his own will without any orders from his former employer. I think the only way his motif being separate from the others on his team could have been done more strongly would be if he had been pushing others down and out of his way in an attempt to climb the corporate ladder, metaphorically devouring them just as a toad does to insects, which would then lead to him fitting in a little better when he joins the bat and bird villains of the next department up. However, as it stands, his motif still works well with him, being one of the ones that more strongly does among the characters. Now, talking about the second half of the show's baddies, we have to start off by talking about Kawarino. This guy was showing up in the first part of the show, and for the most part seemed to be just serving as a messenger for the big bad of the season and the head of the company, Desperaya. He's her right-hand man, after all, but once we've gotten into the second half, his capabilities as a manipulator come out in full force, and he truly earns that chameleon motif that he has at the time we see him take actual villain form. It also becomes clear later that he's something of a new hire, as the second half villain, Bloody, who's been at the company for a while, comments that morale has dipped after he was hired and started working there. It's not hard to see why. This guy is meddling in people's business and pushing them to extremes all for the sake of getting the job done. He's very much pushing that line of wanting those who work for the company to sacrifice every element of their being just for the glory of their leader and accomplishing her goals. What I'm saying is, if Bunby is the manager that puts the pressure on but doesn't push you to the breaking point, Kawarino is the manager who wants you to die if it will make the shareholders a few extra bucks this quarter. The biggest way he interferes with the villains is he's the one that's handing out those black slips that turn into the black mass that give power for the price of everything else. What's really cool is that we're able to see his manipulation get tailored to the way each of the employees he does it to is functioning within the company. With Girinma, his repeated losses make him more and more bitter about his failures, and he is starting to get desperate. Which is when Kawarino shows up and says he's got just the thing that'll make him more powerful enough to take on Precure and get them out of the way for good. Of these, he's the one who has the least context for what's going to actually happen to him, and Kawarino uses that to his advantage to get him to agree easily. With Arachnia, his talking with her takes advantage of the fact that she's pretty prideful and her ego takes a beating as a result of her repeated losses. Of all the characters to get black masked, she's the only one that actually asks for it, perhaps because she's so sure of herself that she thinks she'll be able to retain some level of control. Gamao has long left the company by the time Kawarino shows up in front of him and offers the black slip. By this point, we've seen Gamao struggling with the realities of being out in the real world with nothing to support himself, and his desperation is palpable. The slip lands his hands more as a supposed ticket to get his job back if he does well, but Kawarino knows that if he manages it, he won't be himself anymore either. Harinya of the 2nd Division is sure of herself and feels like she's on the same level as Kawarino rather than under him. She has the vibe of someone who's been with the company a good long while and has gotten herself a little seniority, even if she's not completely in the realm of management. So she's smart enough to resist the offer of the black slip, which means she's the one who gets it forced on her. Bloody is the only character who is offered a black slip and then never really used the black mask at all. He's the one who sees right through Kawarino the most and isn't having any of it. He knows how the company used to run, and he knows this isn't the way things should be done. He's the old guard trying to hold the line, which is why he's still standing when Kawarino has accomplished the goal of the department. He slaps a mask on his face in an instant as a way of laying him off, banishing him down into a dark void. This is the one that really backfires on him, though, as Bloody does manage to claw his way back just enough to drag Kawarino down with him. You can only manipulate for so long without it biting you in the ass, after all. And we should, of course, talk about the actual big bad of the season, Desperaya. She still falls into the category of looming in darkness from a throne like the rest of the biggest bads have spent most of their time doing. Her deal is that she wants immortality to be young and beautiful forever. It stems from a fear of aging and her power waning with the passage of time, which is a common and understandable fear, but also a fact of life that we kind of have to accept. This is something that she despairs about when she thinks about it, and thus she's come to the conclusion that everyone else must despair like her as well. This is, of course, contrasted with the hope of the future that Pretty Cure has. However, a funny thing happens when the final battle comes to a head. Let's first go over the lead up to that final battle, though, since there's been some shakeups this season. 2 big ones right off the bat. Firstly, the girls no longer need to hold hands with anyone or anything in order to transform. They can just do it all on their own as long as they have their transformation items. The hand-holding had been a staple of the series for the most part until this point, and it was clear as day it was becoming something of a limiter when it came to the writing. Now, though, any of the Pretty Cure can transform all on their own to handle a fight themselves or just until the others can get there to help. It frees things up quite a bit and allows us to build the team over the course of a few episodes rather than having them all there at the start, which both allows us to have that little arc with Karen at the beginning and avoids overwhelming the audience with 5 magical girls all at once. The transformations themselves are pretty snappy, and they're done somewhat modular in a way that makes it easy to cut bits and pieces out or leave them in depending on the needs of an episode. Sometimes we'll see everyone's gloves and skirts appear and hair change, and sometimes we'll just see some. The flexibility is something that I think was lacking specifically in Max Heart, so it's good that the team gave themselves a little more wiggle room this time around, and I think that did the series good in order to be able to keep the pace up. Even if there was one episode where I was put through the hell of watching all 5 individually transform back to back. I don't mind that when I'm watching like a transformation compilation, but not so much when I'm watching the show itself. The only complaint that I have is that the choreography in them just isn't very interesting. It's mostly camera cuts and movements while the girls just stand there. The other thing that we've moved away from that is a big change is that we are no longer ending every episode with some big laser attack. This was something that got really repetitive during the other seasons, so I'm glad to see it's been done away with here. The girls all have their singular stock attack that they're able to do, but at least now we're able to shape things up because, once again, this is something that they're able to do on their own. We do the attacks in different orders. Sometimes characters don't use their attack for an episode. While the attacks are still repeated, this does go some of the way of getting rid of some of that sense of repetition so they don't wear on you quite as much. These powers also have a little bit more utility as well, which I was grateful to see. It doesn't come up very often, but there are times where, for instance, Karen will use her water attack as a slide for another character to ride down or turn it into a damn lance instead of using it as a normal attack. And Kamachi has a shield, which is used for protection, pushing characters back, or a way to provide a safe landing for her teammates. This is something I would have loved to see just a touch more of, but getting these few moments of it was really cool. After a certain point, each of the girls start getting their own special weapon that allows them to do a boosted version of their singular magic attack, at which point the old versions are never used again. I do think the slow doling out of these could have been done a little better, though. In some cases, they're well done. Rin's episode, for example, has her facing her fears, learning to communicate better, and having the characteristics she's supposed to represent, passion, be refreshed in her. With all that, she's able to summon her weapon on her own for the first time and make use of it. The original time that these were used, it all happened at once in an intense moment, and nobody really understood what was going on in the moment. Rin's episode was a great way to give her some personal growth that went hand in hand with her being able to summon the weapon like this, tying her growth as a person to her growth as a pretty cure. Nozomi's was similar, with her grappling with being called unfit to be a pretty cure and wondering if that's really true. Sadly, that's not the case for everyone, though. The episode where Urara gets hers feels more like it's a Nozomi episode than an Urara episode, like I mentioned before, and with Karin, it feels a little bit like she was sharing the screen with Komachi the whole time. Focusing in on just the person who is going to be powering up could have made this feel like more of a development for each of them, contributing to the way that this series is so much about growth and learning about themselves. There's also this weird tidbit at the end of the season that makes it feel like there was supposed to be another step up from this. In episode 43, Komachi, who has had a shield for the entire series, reaches this state of zen where she really becomes sure of her path in life in the face of the villain trying to tear her down. In doing this, she unblocks this completely obliterating laser blast that is on par with the episode finishing ones from the prior seasons. This is never brought up or used again, which is just astoundingly out of place. The fact that it only happens to her is strange too. If the series was a bit longer, I think it's not unlikely that we would have gotten all the girls leveling up for a second time just before the final conflict. But as it stands, Komachi's big girl laser feels weirdly out of place. It was a damn cool looking laser though. In fact, the whole season was damn cool looking, with the action animation kicking it back up a notch. The splash start felt like a little bit of a dip for me, but this shot things back up again and I was glad to see it. This season has no shortage of excellently done fights with both creatively animated choreography or simply expressive and powerful animation. We'll talk more about the movie later, but the movie does just kick that up a notch further, containing some of the best action in the entire show. It's also good to see secondary objectives sometimes be added to fights. Often this is something like protecting the mascots or the Colette from being snatched up or harmed. But there was one episode where they had to keep a wedding tiara that Rin had made safe so it wouldn't be destroyed before the ceremony. Little things like that might not seem like much, but in a Monster of the Week series, those shakeups can be something that makes you sit up and pay attention a little more in the middle of a binge, just because they're doing something a little different than normal. Another case comes in with the choice of what will become the Monster of the Week. The Monster of the Week in Pretty Cure has, so far, generally been made out of something in the environment around the fight, but this time around was definitely more of a deliberate action on the part of the villains, as we see them toss out the masks that create the monsters. However, what's cool is there are a few times where the masks get put on something that the girls want to avoid harming, which means we have to take the monster out by really destroying the mask alone. Examples of this include a sparse few times that the masks are put onto the little pinky MacGuffins that we're trying to collect up, and the time that it's a sentimental notebook that belonged to Urara's mother, something that can't be replaced easily if it's harmed. Once again, it's something that shakes things up and makes the stakes of the fight a little higher and more interesting, since we wouldn't care much if the monster was made out of used tires or something like that, but a sentimental object, we need to take care of that. It brings a little strategy into moments that might have otherwise been straight action, though straight action, when well done in a series, can carry us through quite a bit. Action can't save us every time, though, as we find out in the last episodes of the series that make up the big finale, Pretty Cure loses. They lose and don't get to make the wish that's supposed to restore the kingdom to the way it was. The Dream Colette that they've been protecting all season was a one-time use item, and that one use is used up by Big Bad Desperaya. She wins and gets her eternal youth. For her, it was important to do it in front of them to drive home their failure and infect them with the despair that has been ruling her for so long. Obviously, as the antithesis to the villain, these kids aren't going to let that get to them, keeping their hopes up by talking about what they're hoping for in the future, bringing their spirits back up to the point that the despair-based attacks simply can't touch them anymore. They're made strong and invulnerable not by having some extra magic bestowed upon them, but by simply carrying hope with them, which frees them from any damage that this particular villain is able to throw at them, which is a solid way of giving them a boost at the end without making things feel like they came completely out of nowhere. We've already seen how tenacious these girls can be. How is there any coming back from them completely losing, though? Well, it seems that a decent amount of the influence of Desperaya's despairing worldview was coming from some influence from Kawarino, since he's hell-bent on keeping despair up in her. Well, Desperaya herself seems willing to hear Nozomi out when she de-transforms from being Pure Dream to talk to her one-on-one about why she's able to keep up hope. As it turned out, getting what she wanted hasn't done anything to make her feel any better. Camarino gets dragged into darkness to get him out of the picture, and we've got everything else wrapped up with some talk foo. As for the kingdom, upon the revelation that everyone who lived there and vanished is fine, actually, just made to wait with the despair masks on and sit silently in the background the entire season, the mascots get their own renewed hope and vow that if they can't wish the kingdom back into being, they'll just rebuild it by hand with everyone together. And you know what? I'm okay with that. The mascots had spent a little time learning about the value of hard work during the rest of the season, and it seems that once they were assured that all the people of the kingdom were okay, that was enough. Very much a Asgard isn't a place, it's a people moment to wrap things up. And speaking of mascots, it's about time that we actually get into them, huh? Okay, I'm going to delay a second longer to talk about those pinkies that the girls are supposed to be collecting before we get to the main mascots, because holy hell were those underutilized. We're told off the bat that there's 55 of them that we need to be concerned with, but we don't end up seeing nearly that many during the show. Most of the pinky collecting happens exclusively off screen, and the pinkies are in no way tied to fights with the villain unless the villain has managed to get their hands on one. We don't see any sign that the girls are actively hunting them down in any way either. There is one episode where they have to find one that can do healing in order to help a sick mascot, but that's the only time I can recall that they go actively seeking a pinky out. Even the last one that is collected conveniently shows up on top of Nozomi's head as all of them are gearing up to go and hunt that one down. We are told that the pinkies all have their own useful powers, but the only time we see that is with the one that can heal and another who is essentially a magic photocopier. What I'm trying to say is that the pinkies suck and are underutilized to the point that you might forget they're at all relevant until one of them shows up. If you're gonna have a MacGuffin, at least show us the MacGuffin hunt, you know? Beyond the pinkies, though, we've got 3 main mascots that we're working with this season, and I actually like them this time. Mostly because they feel like they're more fleshed out characters than we've had so far. We even have episodes that place them as the focus and are something more than just, oh no, they got lost. I think the big factor that helps in this is that the first 2 mascots we're introduced to, Coco and Nuts, have human forms. Giving them human forms is an instant way to up their agency and give them more room to be their own characters and have their own experiences. In fact, the mascots don't live with any of the Pretty Cure girls this time around. They've got their own little place in a little shop, even if that shop is a loner building from Karin's rich family. And they spend a lot of time in these human forms too, which I have to admit I personally appreciated. A lot of the more serious conversations they have sound a hell of a lot better when we don't have every sentence punctuated by the little mascot phrase that the show obligates them to tack onto the end of their sentences for the sake of cuteness. Coco and Nuts here are both princes of a kingdom, but let's not get too hung up on that since it turns out their king is an elected position. My personal take is that the prince title is something that is just given to those who seem like they have the potential to one day become king. We don't find out about the whole prince thing until deep into the season though, because these little guys are humble enough to just not think it's relevant enough to tell Pretty Cure. To get more specific about them though, let's start with Coco. Simply put, of the 2, he's the nice one. He's generally pleasant and jovial unless talking about a harsher topic, but he's not annoyingly cheery or bubbly, and he certainly lacks any of the demanding qualities of some of the prior mascots. He's basically just melts in as another one of the squad. If there was one issue to take with Coco, it would be the way that there is some inconsistency with him between his human and mascot forms. It's not a huge difference or anything, but there are some points where it's clear that the cutesiness of his dialogues and actions are brought up a few notches when he's all fluffy. This happens a tiny bit with Nuts too, but it's much less pronounced and frequent there, at least that's how I felt. I think this stems from the fact that the vibes of the 2 sides don't really mesh well at first, perhaps because when he's human, he's very much just a regular dude. Nuts, on the other hand, is a little more abrasive. He's not mean, but he can be blunt, and his words can cut a little because of that. When giving a critique, he's not really going to mince things to make them digestible. This causes a little friction, but is generally something that doesn't get in the way too much. He's a little more serious about getting things done than Coco is, but he's not a stick in the mud either. He just keeps everything a little more on track. A lot of this stems from the fact that he's the one that was tricked into opening the door of the kingdom and letting Nightmare in to ravage things in their search for the Colette. He's a guy that's got baggage, and he carries it around with him. He makes for a pretty damn solid mascot character because he feels really relevant and he can stand on his own enough for us to wind a whole episode around his internal conflicts. And then we have Milk. Milk is our character introduced a smidge before the middle of the season, and when she comes in, it's like a little bit of a truck. She's the only one that doesn't get a human form, leaving her pretty physically useless a lot of the time. She's a hard worker as someone who is training to be a caretaker for Coco and Nuts, and it's clear that she takes that super seriously and wants to do as much as she can to support them. And she's also a huge bitch. Milk had, and still has me, a little torn. I can totally see why it seems like a lot of people just do not like her. She can be rude and standoffish, even mean at times, and even when it does seem like she's going to make some kind of progress, she backslides very easily. She seems to hate Nozomi in particular, constantly stealing her food and weaseling her way out of taking the blame for starting a fight when Nozomi actually does take the bait and bite back a little. She gives off mean girl vibes, and while one of her earlier episodes does urge us to consider her circumstances of her home being destroyed and her having to wander alone for who knows how long, it's hard to take that as an explanation for her behavior when she never really seems to make an effort to be any better. On the other hand, there are some moments where I had a lot of fun with all that huge bitch energy. Milk is a bit of a shit stirrer, which I think the season actually needed. The times that there are conflict within the group were few and far between, and I think having everything be happy sunshine hour among the friend group, aside from like the single episode where Rin and Karn rub up against each other along, would have gotten a little stale. Milk brings a little friction into things and livens it up. The problem with all that friction tying back to Milk, though, is the fact that she's the common denominator becomes super obvious, which makes her an easy hate sink. Milk, unfortunately, is also kinda dumb. The fact is, the final conflict kicks off because she is so eager to please Coco that she just hands over the Colette with all the pinkies inside of it, meaning that it is in wish-granting mode, to someone disguised as Coco that's acting sketchy enough that the rest of the group is noticing even less than a minute after its replacement, and that's not great. It feels far too convenient when this is a girl who really wants to take care of these princes, yet she can't recognize when one of them is acting off because he asked her to do something for him. That's bad enough, but remembering all this comes just a few episodes on the heels of her having a big moment of protecting the Colette all on her own and saying she's never going to give it up to the villains just puts a further damper on things. In short, Milk suffers from tiny writing problems that pile on top of each other to make her an easy hate sink in a series that otherwise has perfectly likable characters all around. She's used for convenience and rarely allowed actual growth, which I think is a shame. If given some room to actually grow, get better, and apologize to those she's been horrible to, I think she could have ended the season much better off. Also, she is simply just the cutest of the mascots of this season. Look at her. Okay, now if you're watching this as someone who has actually watched the series, there might seem like there's something that I've been avoiding in regards to the mascots. And you're right, I have been avoiding it. The whole reason I pushed them back in this video was to kind of delay talking about the inevitable. Okay, let's talk about the time that Pretty Cure had a mascot and a Pretty Cure fall in love. Okay, so I guess we do have to kind of talk about Nozomi and Coco, don't we? Maybe I should really put this off until I've watched the sequel season Go-Go and talk about it then, but I also feel I've got to lay some groundwork now, so I guess we can always just circle back to the topic if there are any drastic changes when it comes to Go-Go. To start off, I'm going to link this write-up that I found in a comment by a Reddit user whose account has sadly been deleted, so I can't properly credit them. I came across it while I was trying to figure out my own thoughts on this element of the series, and I share a lot of my thoughts with them, which helped me get my feelings about this in order. It's well written and worth a read. I'm also going to be using the overall post that the comment came from to get the gist of what some of the common complaints are about the Coco and Nozomi situation so that we can talk about them. I know this is a very small sample size on one website, but it did give me a general idea of the complaints, and considering a lot of them were repeated and consistent, it seems like these are likely the pillars of dislike for this plot element. Let me start off by saying I am partially in favor of this relationship. I'm not saying that's something I'm going to be actively seeking out fan fiction or fan art for, but it is something that I am not upset by in the series, and I even find some of the interactions between these two that are meant to be more romantically charged pretty cute. It's one of those things that I understand why some people might have a negative knee-jerk reaction to it, but I don't think I can completely share their feelings. Like the poster I mentioned, I think a lot of this comes down to people looking at the surface level of what's going on here and not digging deeper into it. There seem to be 3 things that kind of set people off in various combinations and to various degrees. 1. Coco is a fluffy little mascot chinchilla thing. 2. Coco is way older than her and the age gap is gross. 3. Coco is her teacher and teacher-student relationships are predatory. Let's run these down in that order, since that's really the order of least to most complex to deal with. Let's start with the chinchilla thing. Okay, obviously it's gonna feel a little weird that his true form is a little chinchilla. Obviously, this cute and cuddly little ball of mascot fluff isn't something that we expect for a love interest in something other than a show like Hamtaro. He's just a little guy, you know? But also, it's a fantasy series. This is one of those things that can be a little odd, but we can let it slide because it's not like this is gonna go encourage little girls to go around smooching sentient squirrels. There is an inherent unreality that keeps this from being something that we need to be concerned about actually happening in the world. Let's be real. There is a whole romance and even smut subgenre dedicated to giving a smooch to the supernatural, some even into full monster territory. That's not what this is, though. This is a light and fluffy romance subplot in an anime for kids. He may be a mascot, but this is also the first time that a Pretty Cure mascot has gotten themselves one of those fancy Nancy human forms. While Nozomi definitely has an affection for Coco, no matter what form he is currently taking on, to me at least, it seems like she only has an actual attraction to him when he's looking human, which makes a ton of sense. I totally understand why some people might not be into the idea that he turns into a little fluffy mascot, but it's one of those things that we can just mostly hand wave away as fantasy nonsense, since the show doesn't seem all that interested in commenting on it either. Human and inhuman romances happen in fantasy stuff all the time. Just this time, he's not some elf or something like that. It's also the problem of the trifecta that people tend to dwell on the least, though. So let's get into the ones that people hold on to a little more strongly. Second issue, there is an age gap between them, and that's gross, and people don't like it. Look, I get it. Some people don't like the idea when there is a big age gap between characters in a relationship, especially when it comes to teenage characters. I do think that there are some people who take that to the extreme when they critique it, but I'm going to assume we're all reasonable people here, okay? I get it. I side-eyed the seniors dating the freshmen in high school too. However, let's all remember as well that fiction and reality are different things. So at the start of the series, Nozomi is 14, a perfectly reasonable age to be interested in dating and to start doing so. And Coco is... Yeah, see, that's the crux of the problem when it comes to this. We just don't know how old Coco is meant to be. The guesses that people have made range wildly all over the place. I've seen some people claim they see him as old as 25, and some sit it at the more 18 to 20 mark. The issue is that we're just never told, and let's be real, the art direction and character design of a show can make trying to determine age in anime quite difficult at times. For example, this is Jotaro from JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. At first glance, this is clearly a full-grown man. But no, actually, he's 17. Okay, for a less extreme example, you have Gilbert from Violet Evergarden. He's apparently officially 29, but without knowing his age, when I watched the show, I could have pegged him as anywhere from 20 to 30. What I'm trying to say here is that even without getting into the territory of, oh, she might look like a child, but she's actually 1,000 years old, the way that anime simplifies human features means that their designs can leave a lot of room for ambiguity in age. What age you think Coco is depends a lot on your personal perception of how his human form looks. For me, you could tell me any number between 16 and 21 and I'd say that tracks. That's just me though. I think people classifying him as being a full adult are perhaps being a little hyperbolic though. To me, it seems like the intent was to make him seem like he's an older teenager, but still a teen. Once again, your mileage may vary, obviously, and that's also if we assume that his human form is something that even actually correlates to his age in the first place. He does seem to have the responsibilities of an adult in his homeland, but that is a magic little realm, and clearly things are a little skewed. Milk is the only mascot to have her age explicitly stated, and we're told that she is about equivalent to a 14-year-old, but she's already in a workplace apprenticeship, and while she may act a little mature, she seems to have a level of agency to be on her own and working, more like a college student in a work placement program. Coco is depicted as being a bit older than her, but we're never given an indication of how much older, bringing us back to the issue that his age just isn't stated at any point. I have seen people point to the fact that he was able to get a job at the Pretty Cure Squad's school as proof that he is a full adult, but we don't know how that went down at all. He is a magical creature from another world. Are you telling me that he's got the identifying legal documents he would need to get hired? He's hired as an interim substitute, but are you telling me this man has his Japanese teaching license that he was just able to whip out? Obviously, some magical shenanigans went down to get him the gig, if only as much to make him some fake paperwork, at which point the school would just go off of whatever age his documents said he was, which we also have no idea about. A lot of this could have simply been cleared up by him stating his age at some point, but that never happened as far as I could tell. I will keep a careful eye out in Go-Go, but I can't say that I expect it to come up there at all either. To be clear, if this was reality, I would definitely side-eye a 17 or 18-year-old dating a 14-year-old, but when it comes to something like Pretty Cure, I'm willing to let it slide a little more and not be fussed about it. These are fictional characters. Their ages are arbitrary numbers given to them for the sake of marketing. You could change literally nothing about Nozomi, change her school to a high school, and say that she was 17, and nothing about the show would change. And the last big issue people have, he's her teacher, and teacher-student relationships are predatory. Now, this is one I actually see some merit in. Teachers trying to date their students is indeed predatory, no matter what level of education we're talking about. It's all based on the fact that the teacher just inherently has power over the student in every situation, and that power imbalance leaves so much room for predatory behavior. And once you're in anything high school or lower, it's not going to be legal in the first place, given that the student is underage. Now, we're not going to touch on the age thing because I just spent a while going over that, but I do think people who are going, Coco is her teacher and that makes it predatory, either haven't watched the series or are looking at this at the purest of service level without putting a large amount of critical thought into it at all. First off, while Coco is Nozomi's homeroom teacher, he's doing so in what is meant to be a substitute basis and purely so that he is available at the girls' school. In every interaction with him, Pretty Cure never treat him like he is actually their teacher, nor does he seem to expect that kind of respect from them. They are constantly having to correct themselves when they address him at school, since they go to speak much more casually than would normally be polite behavior between teachers and students. This is something that is shown exceptionally rarely as well in a sparse handful of moments, and even in those, we never actually see him teach, mostly just dismissing the class at the end of the day or for lunch. In fact, there are points in the series where you could easily forget that it was ever really part of the show since he shows up doing it so rarely. Nozomi had already met and befriended Coco before he started in on the job as well. The fact that he's serving as a substitute teacher is actually something of a plot twist that is indeed done purely for them to be able to be easily in contact because the accessory shop as a home base hadn't been established yet at that point. He is her teacher, but it's also something of a sham. He has never been her teacher in the traditional sense that would normally happen because, might I remind you, he is really a fluffy little magical girl mascot. And let's remember, when he is a fluffy little mascot, he is completely and utterly powerless to do anything on his own. We don't know how durable the human forms are, but from what we're shown this season, a decent enough blow is enough to have the mascots back in their mascot shape. It's not a stretch to say that they're just not suited for doing any combat at all, and the human forms are mostly for the utility of existing in the human world and interacting with things like stairs and doors. Remember how we talked about the power dynamic being something that's the problem when it comes to student-teacher relationships? Well, that kind of gets flipped on its head when the student in this case is constantly saving the life of the supposed teacher. In school, the power is tipped in his favor, but anything outside the classroom, Nozomi is the protector who's holding all the cards. Now, am I trying to say this balances out to a fair real-world scenario? Absolutely not, which is why it's important to remember this isn't a real-world scenario, and within the framework of fiction, the power dynamic issue is just one that's not here. This is one of those elements of the series that, while I can understand a snap judgment based on surface level or just reading a synopsis, I think when you actually take a look at how it's handled in the series, it's just not something that's predatory. And to be clear, I don't think that teacher-student romances are something that should be just allowed to exist uncritically in media. But given the way that the teacher part is minimally present in the show, and the way that it's not treated as an actual serious thing when it is there, I don't think we have to be worried that this is going to cause a rash of little girls who decide they want to date their teachers. Especially when none of the moments they have, which are meant to be the tender ones where a relationship really stirs, happen at the school or in a school setting. Hell, they never even kiss or have a moment where they do become a couple. In this season, at least, it's more ship teases than anything else, where we're well aware that they like each other, but nothing is really acted on. If you really want to stretch, you could say the way their faces move slightly closer together in this shot near the end of the season is maybe an implication that they kiss once the camera cuts away, but that is really stretching it. Like I said at the start of this, I think this relationship is ultimately harmless and decently cute. But it's not like I'm going to stand here and proclaim my love for it either. It's an element of the show, and that's fine by me. There are moments where I can feel it working, and those are sweet scenes. In particular, I'm a fan of the scene where Nozomi and Coco are on a boat together at night. It's just pleasant. I did not spend over 2,000 words of my script about this show talking about this because it's my favorite part of the show, but more because I think there are some severe misinterpretations here, and people are taking this element of the series both wildly out of context and as something that is completely malicious, when it's really not. I saw someone calling this lolicon, and I saw another say it promotes grooming, and y'all, it doesn't. It just doesn't. If you don't like this as an element of the series, I can completely understand that. But I do think that when it comes to talking about it, the conversations could be just a little more level-headed instead of everyone just assuming the worst. And I'm not going to spend any more time on this unless things drastically change in the next season, because I have spilled more than enough digital ink on this. Let's get into the movie then. This time around, we have Yes, Pretty Cure 5, The Mirror Kingdom's Miraculous Adventure, running a brisk 70 minutes long. The first thing I noticed when I was watching this was the way that Coco and Nuts personally welcomed us to the movie and told us all about how to use the little plastic lights the screening audience of the time would have been given. These little things are called miracle lights, and I'm given to understand that after this point they're going to be a consistent presence in the movies to give them a level of interactivity so the kids can feel like they're helping to save the day. I expect then that we'll get instructions given like this at the start of every one of these films from here on out, so I will be keeping track of these in order to rank how well they're done, because if there's anything about me, I love ranking things. This one was comprehensive, which is to be expected for the first time, but I do think it went on a little long, taking up almost 3 minutes of the video that I had access to. I would assume, though, that once again, the length comes from the fact that this is the first time that the series is doing this, so this is both their first time making the announcement and the first time they're explaining things to the kiddos. They just haven't figured out how little or how much they need to say yet. Getting into the movie itself, I think this was a really fun one. It falls into an old standby plot, of course, that being a series of mirror fights of dark reflections of the main cast. But I think it does it well. It does mean a lot of the runtime of the movie is taken up by these fights, but damn it, the fights don't look completely fantastic, so I don't mind that much at all. Each of the girls gets a clone fight with a literal dark reflection of themselves. Not only that, they're separated in order to have to deal with these fights on their own as their shadow clones mock their insecurities alright. If I'm being honest, each of these plays into their characters pretty well and feel like they make sense for each of them, except one. Rin's clone tries to tell her that having friends is simply inconvenient. Giving Rin's strong sense of responsibility to others, yeah, having tons of things you feel obligated to help your friends out with would be something of a mental burden. but that's not really the way the clone is talking about it, and Rin isn't gonna just give up on her friends that easily. Urawa's clone tries to tell her that trying to please others isn't gonna get her anywhere. Urawa is an actress, and part of that is making sure she pleases the audience and the people she's working with so that she'll continue to get work. While that could be an emotional burden, Urawa doesn't see it that way. Komachi's was my favorite since her clone basically mocks her for only having a shield and being unable to fight back at all on her own, saying that her ability to protect isn't worth much at all. This is something we never really see Komachi struggle with in the series, but there's not really a time where she's fighting all by herself either, so there wasn't really a chance for it to come up. This isn't a struggle of hers that we know, but it's also one that feels perfectly reasonable for her to have at the same time. Despite how this never came up in the series proper, I completely believe it for her. Karen's clone is probably the best done because it's really an extension from her arc early in the series, talking about not needing anyone else and preying on that still freshly learned lesson with her. It's not any new territory for Karen, but it's something that we know to be a common thing for her, so it makes sense for it to come up again here. I'd say about half the fights happen in visually interesting locations, while the other half are a little boringly located. Urawa and Komachi are just someplace in a city at night, and they do try to make use of their environment in the fight. To be fair, they also come off a little boring compared to Rin and Karen. Rin's is in this strange other world where there's big floating bubbles, and Karen's is in what is likely my favorite, this grand and beautiful flower field that makes it feel like she's getting something of a samurai moment. Nozomi is also in a city location, but hers is made up for by having this cool set piece of a Ferris wheel lit up in the background for the majority of the fight. And I guess we should talk about Nozomi in this movie since I didn't bring her up before. Her clone doesn't really play on any sort of insecurity, unfortunately, mostly just talking about how Nozomi isn't strong enough to beat her and all. That's because the film is doing something specifically different with Nozomi's shadow clone than the others. The thing is that this one asks of Nozomi when they get split off, "Why are you so happy to fight with your friends?" To which Nozomi is basically like, "Why do you even have to ask that?" Obviously, if Nozomi is an ultimate little hope and sunshine bubble, her shadow self is the opposite, not understanding what drives Nozomi and why being with her friends makes her happy. Which is why Nozomi obviously befriends her and gets her on the main character's side. Nozomi doesn't really get an arc in this movie, but her shadow clone does, which is done decently well for the short runtime here and for a movie that is basically Precure on Precure fights the movie. Let me reiterate, the fights in this movie are awesome. It's worth watching for them alone. And I honestly think you can watch this mostly context-free as long as you understand basic magical girl tropes. There is this really amazing moment where Nozomi deflects an attack into the Ferris wheel and the entire movie goes silent as it happens, which really makes her feel like a true badass. Of all the Precure movies that I've watched, this is the only one so far I could see myself watching again. So far, the movies have basically felt like extended episodes, but this time around it actually felt like a movie. Once again, it's time to talk about magic items. For those who maybe haven't watched my other Pretty Cure videos, I am well aware that a big part of the point of these series is to sell plastic toys to children, but my concern is just how well these toy elements are woven into the fabric of the series. Basically, do they make me feel like I'm being marketed to or not? This time, I think they actually did a pretty good job of weaving the toyetic elements in a way that it didn't feel like they were becoming a burden or without an actual narrative purpose. Pretty much everything that was in the show felt like it had a reason to be there and was used in ways that felt justified. And I suppose I should clear up what I am talking about when talking about items and merch for the season. I'm not going to talk about literally everything. I am usually only going to talk about the things that actually show up in a show since I'm looking at this from the angle of their integration into what I watched. So we're not going to talk about this toy microphone machine or toy keyboard, for example. First up is the Pinky Catch, the transformation item of this season, but it's pulling double duty, which is kind of nifty. It's not only used to transform, but it is also how they catch the MacGuffins and how they hold them until they are able to transfer them to a more permanent home. I think this double duty was likely put in because this is the first time the mascots are not living inside the transformation items. It's shaped like a watch, which is a nice understated way to hide the things, just like them looking like a cell phone before, and I do think the design of these is cute. Magic watch that can turn you into a superhero is just a cool thing for a kid's show, what can I say? But now to get into something that really did feel like a deliberate marketing tactic. So this is the first time that the show has deliberately called attention to the fact that the transformation items of the season have special carrying bags or holding boxes. They did have these in prior seasons, but little, if any, attention was called to them. They were just something there for the convenience. These little bags even carried over to the transformations, because let's be real, there's no way those costumes have pockets. You've also always been able to buy these carrying cases as well, but this is the first time the show itself has marketed them. There is a holding case for the Pinky catches for things like when the girls have to wash their hands or bathe or go to bed. This is a concern that Nuts brings up in an early episode when he sees Nozomi just take her watch off and set it on a counter to wash her hands. To be fair, that is a vulnerable and grabbable place to put it. So each girl is given one of these boxes to keep it in. I think part of the reason this feels like marketing is because the girls are given these for an imagined problem and then they are never mentioned again. If in the episode her watch had indeed been snatched when she took it off to wash her hands and the fight was to get it back, this might have felt better integrated. But given it comes up this one time and never again, it feels like a marketing tactic. The Dream Colette is the MacGuffin holder of the season with the added benefit that it gives a wish when all the MacGuffins are in it. We don't actually see a whole lot of the Pinkies get put into the thing, but a lot of that is because we don't see nearly as much Pinky collecting as you might expect there to be. So this is only used a few times. However, the wish-granting part does mean this is something that the villains are actively trying to get their hands on for the whole series, so it is part of the action quite a bit. It's not uncommon for a secondary objective of fights to be playing keep away with it. I stated before, I generally have no problem with a MacGuffin holding item, and this is no exception. I also appreciated that this time it was something that did have to be protected and didn't just poof away into nothingness when not in use. Not exactly a magic item, but something that did show up in the show and I immediately pinged as being a toy due to the way it was presented was this bead machine thing for making bracelets. We see Reen use it several times, and I have to admit that from looking at it, I'm not entirely sure how it works. I don't mind this as being something in the show, even if I might have preferred to see Reen doing some non-toy crafting, since it seems like she's kind of reliant on the machine to do her accessory making from the way it's presented. My only other issue is that she supposedly makes use of this, at least in part, to make the wedding tiara she crafts partway through the series, and I'm not sure if this toy is totally capable of actually making something like that. However, I don't have the capability to test it myself, given it's pretty hard to get your hands on a Japan-exclusive side toy from a 16-year-old TV show, and even if I could find one, it'd likely be more expensive than I'm willing to shell out just for curiosity. Last of the magic items, yeah, that's right, there's not a whole lot of them this time, is the Symphony set. This is the name that never comes up in the series for the whole set of magic weapons that the girls are able to use and then eventually summon for themselves. And I want to take a moment to talk about these because I was really pleased with their usage in the show. They come into the show in a convenient way, having been conveniently brought along with Milk after she presumably looted them from the kingdom, but I have to say that after that, their usage is pretty damn stellar. The first time they're used is for a big explosion attack that is really cool. I was worried, though, that it would become like the big final lasers of the last few seasons, but that never happened. The items are absorbed into the girls, and once they manage to summon them on their own for the first time, they become their way to attack and deal with enemies. The big combined blast is only used in the appropriate moments, either for a very powerful enemy that it really needs to be used on, or in a moment of really heightened emotion where the size of the blast matches the emotion of the scene. What I personally found pretty neat is that for a while we saw each time the girls summon their weapons. But once they had them, this was something that slowly faded out over time until they just had their weapon when they needed to attack. I don't know if this was intentional on the part of the show staff or just a way to cut down on repeating too much animation, but I ended up taking it as a way of showing that summoning and using these weapons had become second nature to the team. If that was intentional, it was quite well done, and if it's not, it's a little flash to show their growth that I can read something into. It's about time that we get into the fashion side of things because, as usual, transformation and pretty costumes are a big part of the magical girl appeal. I do think these costumes are a step up from Splash Dark for sure, but that's not surprising since I really disliked those costumes in particular. This time around, they've given the girls a more standardized uniform, but with some differentiation between them all, which I think is a fun idea, and let's face it, it was bound to happen at some point in the series. I like a shared uniform, but I don't want them all to be exactly the same, so let's get a bit of a closer look at them. And as always, you are completely free to disagree with me on any of this. Before we get into any specifics, there are 2 overall design flaws that I want to call out. The base of all of their costumes is taken up by a huge swath of this eggshell cream color. At first glance, you might read it as white, but it's not. It's got a tinge of yellow to it. It ends up making their primary color look like accents. If they didn't want a pure white, I think the solution was to go with a very, very light pastel of their core color instead of putting everyone in this cream. The second design flaw is a little less with the costumes and more with the transformation item. All of them have the pink-purple wristband, and on some of them this ends up standing out like a sore thumb. The easy remedy here was just to make the band their core color so it suited the rest of the design more, but that's not what happened. One detail I noticed is that the girls who are in the same school year tend to share design elements, and I don't know exactly how the magic works out with that, but I have to say it was a positive for some and a negative for others, unfortunately. Coming in last place, it could only be Cure Mint. This girl was done pretty damn dirty here. She already had the most unfortunate haircut out of any of the characters when she was a civilian, and this just made it all the worse by teasing it up to the high heavens and then making that rat tail she had even longer and doubling it. I had a visceral reaction the first time I saw her design purely based on the hair alone. Moving down from the hair, we get into the sleeves that I personally just don't like. To me, they feel a bit puffy and odd. That's definitely something that comes down to personal taste, though. I have similar feelings about her boots as well. I don't like this weird little butterfly motif that's slapped on here, and with the way the ankle on them is too big, it looks like they're gonna fall off. Komachi in particular suffers with the way that terrible eggshell cream and the green interact. To me, it adds like a green tinge to the cream, but not in that pastel way, but more in a sickly way. 4th place goes to Cure Lemonade. I technically have more numerous problems with her design, but those problems are smaller than Mint's, and she didn't give me the same visceral reaction, so she just barely edged her way into 4th place. Her major flaw is that she just does not fit in with the rest of the lineup of characters, standing out in the worst way. I understand that design differences are to some extent because she is the only first-year student, but the differences are really stark, which sets her apart and makes her look like she's not part of the rest of the group. While I do like the Peter Pan style collar the shoe has going on, and I like the long stockings with the ruffle at the top, I don't think those 2 items go together very well. Just one or the other would have been better to make them look more cohesive. In a similar vein, while I do like that she has this big fluffy sort of tutu crinoline under her skirt, it also draws attention to how she's the only one that doesn't have any shorts on underneath it. On the same note but different, she's also the only one that has these bunched up sleeves, and while they're not terrible, it's not like I like them either. She's also the only one who has the bow from the back of her costume on as a choker. While it's cute, it's very strange that she's the only one that didn't have it at the top of her skirt. For a little while, I didn't even register that she had the back bow on as a choker at all, just thinking she didn't have a bow on the back at all. And the last thing she has different from everyone else is in something that she lacks rather than having different. She is the only one that doesn't have some kind of butterfly hair accessory, which is really odd. Perhaps the cones and strands are meant to emulate a basic butterfly wing shape. If that was the goal, it's not working. I don't love this hair either, but to be clear, but I do think it's one of those things that does look better in motion than in stills. To wrap her up, let's talk color. The one saving grace Urara has is that her color does go along well with that cream color that dominates the outfits. If she were going to get the light pastel treatment that I mentioned before, this is about the color I would have expected for her. But for every victory, there must be a flaw. Her color flaw comes in the form of her chest butterfly. All the girls have these, but Lemonade's is weird. Hers doesn't match her core color scheme. Reen's doesn't match either, to be fair, but at least for Reen, hers is purple, a color that no other girl has anywhere in their design. Urara's here is pink, which is Nozomi's color. My guess is that a yellow butterfly didn't look all that great when they tried it on her, but I did a very, very quick and dirty Photoshop job here, and it looks alright to me. Third place is Cure Aqua, and this is where I start to like the designs. Most of the problems here are ones that are holdovers from Cure Mint. Once again, I don't really like the boots or the sleeves. However, while she is one where the cream of the dress doesn't really work, it is at least passable, and her ponytail is doing a lot of the heavy lifting to carry this design. I might be personally biased towards magical girls with big, high ponytails like this. Second place goes to Cure Rouge. For her, the only gripe I have is the fact that her butterfly is purple for some reason. Once again, I did a quick Photoshop job and the red looks fine, but in this case, I could see how the red would feel a little overwhelming. As for what I do like about her design, I really, really love the wrap design of the boots. These look like they're secure, but they've also got an interesting design detail to them. They're one of those things that I don't think I could ever pull off in real life, but it's a design concept that is super fun. I also love that her hair is asymmetrical, the only one out of the main group to do so, and I think it gives her a little flair. She's the only one that doesn't get much of a hair change though. Hers just gets a little spikier, and that's about it. And in first place, the only one left, Cure Dream. Now, she's not here just because she's the lead, but being the lead did give her a great design. For one, I think that the colors work really well together here. In particular, I think that her hair meshes really well with the primary pink that's used as the accents in her clothing. She's also got the shoes that I love, though hers are slightly different than Reen's. Instead of the solid boot, she's got a little bit of a collar around her shoe, but that suits her given her plucky fantasy hero energy. I'm not super in love with the hair butterflies being yellow, but those at least blend in with the cream of the dress, and they do draw attention to my favorite hair of the team. It's super cute. The only issue I take with the design is that I don't like it. It's a crop top. I'm not opposed to all crop tops on Magical Girls, but this one just felt a little out of place for me for a reason that I can't quite put my finger on. If you are watching this when it came out and it came out on time, happy Pride Month! So it's funny, this is the season that felt both the straightest and the least straight so far. I mean, they're not subtle about the whole Coco and Nozomi thing, and even Komachi has a very obvious crush on Nuts, even if it doesn't seem to be in any way reciprocated. It's the first season that has a romance element to it where I feel like there is some level of progress and understanding between the two characters involved instead of just having a pining crush that doesn't go anywhere. Yet at the same time, there are some elements here that come back around to slap us with some moments that feel like an implication in their own way. It would be very, very easy to read Urara as having a crush on Nozomi. I mean, I'm sure it's actually meant to be written as like a big sister sort of appreciation, but there are some times where she just looks at Nozomi a certain way or says things that make me go, oh yeah? It's not something that's really lingered on, but it feels like a clear element that's there, which is funny because the ship between Coco and Nozomi is being teased right from the start of the series. I mean, when asked if she has a boyfriend, Urara straight up goes, I don't have a boyfriend, but I do have someone who I admire, Nozomi. And like, you could bring up admiring Nozomi without setting it right next to the idea of her having a boyfriend. Putting those two next to each other makes it feel like an implication. What I'm saying is, I think Urara has a crush on Nozomi, and I think it is supported by the text. I guess this is their way of making up for the whole hand-holding subtext being completely gone this season, since it's not something the characters are really doing anymore since they don't need to. One thing that I think doesn't completely fit this topic, but I have literally nowhere else to put it and is kind of tangentially related. Nozomi's shadow clone in the movie does die, but in this big dramatic moment sort of way, so it's touching and all. But all I could think while watching it was, why is Nozomi holding her clone like a dying lover? Yes 5 is a season that feels like we're finally getting the formula down and we're starting to branch out and try some new things. And I think that's partially because this is the season that started to pull in elements from Sentai shows to help scaffold things a little. Like color coding the characters more strongly and having a larger team. If there's one thing that this season really did is that kept things varied and that I didn't feel like that wearing repetition of the other seasons was starting to creep in. There are some things that could have been worked on, like spreading the spotlight around the season, even if there's always going to be a lead of a season, just to keep it from feeling like a character is being overlooked. Though I can understand that this is the first time that this series has done a cast that is this large, and it was a bit of a balancing act. I'm also a little concerned with what it is we're going to do next season, since it feels like everyone has reached the point of being a more rounded person, and I don't know if there's nearly as much room for them to grow. Obviously, this is something that I'm just going to have to wait and see as I get into Go-Go, but I think I can say that I'm looking forward to it. I like this cast, and I'm happy to spend more time with them, but I am worried about what the quality of that time might be. If you have stayed this long, please stick around just a moment longer and hear me out. I am a very, very tiny YouTuber in a big C. I know that people ask you to do the like, comment, and subscribe stuff all the time, but for a small channel like mine, it really does make a difference. I'm being serious. At time of writing, my first 2 videos in this series got 9 and 10 likes, and the view count hovers around 150 for each of them. The most recent on Splashdar got 39 likes and broke 700 views recently to become the most viewed video on my channel. I am not kidding when I say that interaction beyond just watching really helps me here, and I am exceptionally grateful to each and every view, like, and more. And I would really like to talk with you guys in the comments on where you agreed or disagreed with me. I love discussing media and would truly like to know what you guys think about this season. Thank you so very much.